Hey, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Happy Friday.
TGIF.
Yes, it's felt like 3 weeks since I've seen y'all. There's been so much going on, not just in Columbia, but everywhere. I think I've been at the State Chamber annual meeting this week. It was great. I was going to talk a little bit about that, but then we had the election, and I was going to talk about that. And then we had redistricting, and I was going to talk about that. And then we had OSHA. OSHA wins today. But let me just point out a couple things. One, everybody seen the election results, but big runoff coming up in 2 weeks. We are going to have a debate Monday afternoon, 4 o'clock at the Russell House at USC with the mayoral candidates, Tamika Isaac Devine and Daniel Rickman. So please pay attention to that. We will have it on our I'm sure we'll Facebook it live, but it will also be recorded for your viewership a little later on in the day, or whenever you want to see it. But listen, my goal on Monday, it ain't gonna be softball niceties, bland, boring forum. I hope. I like it when it's a little politely chippy. If that's the right word. I'd love to see a little bit of distinction between the candidates. I think that helps everybody grow a little bit. So hold your breath for Monday. But with that, I also want to point out, we'll talk about this next week because I think this is the biggest deal going in Columbia right now, other than the med school. The fact that we're getting a Senate seat erased out of our Richland County and a little bit of Lexington County. That is a big deal. I mean, huge deal that we need to pay attention to. So it's not a done deal by any stretch, but you cannot find any more plan written for the incumbent. The incumbent protection plan is what I'm going to call this redistricting map. It is horrible. So I'll follow up with y'all next week on that one, but it's in the paper today. You'll see it, but it was released yesterday. But with all the elections and all the redoing the maps, let me tell you, OSHA was the president announced some stuff back in September to talk about vaccine mandates for companies. And that was a big topic down at the State Chamber annual meeting when a very large healthcare provider in the state said 40% of their nurses are not vaccinated. Let me make sure you hear that. 40% of nurses in this particular hospital were not vaccinated. Well, now we have a mandate that says you got to have it done you got to have both shots in the arm by January. And so that's a big deal. Airlines are requiring it. Companies are requiring it. Ford just announced this week they're requiring it. So OSHA came down with its standards yesterday. And when I know a bunch about a little things, but when stuff like this, I call one person, that's Bill Duda at Ogletree, and he's the managing partner at Ogletree, great firm here in town. And I said, Bill, I need some help digesting this stuff. Better yet, you want to have coffee tomorrow. So Bill's here with us today. Thanks for taking the time, Bill. I've asked him just to give an overview of what's going on, because I really do think that this has some huge implications for everybody. If you're a small business owner, maybe not, but if you're part of a larger firm, absolutely. So with that, that's all I know about it. And I'm going to turn it over to Bill Duda for a few questions and give a high level overview of what this means to you. Hey, Bill, how you doing?
Hey, good morning, Carl. How are you? Good morning, everybody. Hope everybody's doing good on a Friday morning.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, happy to be here. This is and look, this is brand new, kind of. We've been speculating for a long time what this was going to look like when it dropped. And yesterday morning it did. So my yesterday was filled with a lot of conversations like this with a lot of different people. I think it's like 490 pages or something. But what Carl asked me to do, and which I can do for you this morning, is give you some of the big ticket items here. And the ticket items I'm going to give you are actually the requirements out of the CTS. But let me preface all this with the fact that we've got a governor who's indicated he'll fight him to the gates of hell on this, who has already told his agencies and his cabinet to not enforce this thing. We've got a state OSHA of our own, which means there's a little bit of a buffer between the way the state OSHA and the federal OSHA works for enforcement purposes. I mean, they've got 30 days to adopt either these standards or something that's the equivalent to them. And they got 15 days to tell federal OSHA what they're going to do in that regard. And to a certain extent, maybe they've already told them indirectly through the government, they're not going to do anything with these. But they took a very similar position with the healthcare ETS in terms of not adopting them or attempting to say that the current regulations they had in place were sufficient. The federal government pushed back, threatened to decertify them, and they ultimately adopted them shortly after that. So we'll probably have a similar dance here, but I think the music's going to be a little louder. I think there's going to be a lot more of a tussle here, and you're going to see across the country, there's already lawsuits filed. There'll be more lawsuits filed. They're going to file them across the country in a number of different places, because if you can get a federal injunction from one judge somewhere, that could stop it in its tracks. We saw that with, if you think back to when they were going to amend the Fair Labor Standards Act regulations and increase salary levels on folks from several years ago. There was a singular federal judge who stopped that in its tracks. And then ultimately on the change of administrations, and this is a little dated, they didn't do anything with those regulations. They did not go into effect, despite all the efforts employers have taken to comply with them. So bear in mind that the stuff I'm getting ready to tell you that's contained in the emergency temporary standard is subject to a huge fight on multiple fronts in our state and elsewhere. And so, a lot of this, one of the questions I get yesterday is, Bill, do we even have to do this? Is the governor going to stop this? And what I've told them is, stay on his Twitter, stay on the news. Let's see what the actual impact of this is. But you're going to have to, each business who's affected by this is going to have to make its own decisions about how much it wants to drag its feet in the hopes that either our state or some other state through a federal decision is going to delay the implementation of this ETS. So bear that in mind. You're going to have to make that individual decision on your own with whatever counsel you typically seek on those kind of things. With that big, huge caveat, right? The fact that we know that this is subject to a big fight. And I guess let me encapsulate the fight for you that you're likely going to see most often is for an emergency temporary standard to be issued. What that means is they didn't go through a normal process of promulgating a rule, which agencies have to do, right? They have to show that there is a grave danger to the public in order to go this route, to push it through this quickly. And the grave danger standard is where emergency temporary standards have failed historically. And when we've been dealing with this for as long as we've been dealing with it, they may have a tough hill to climb when it comes to meeting that standard. If you look at the ETS in any detail, you see they spend an excruciatingly large amount of time talking about that standard because they know that's where the legal challenge is. But that's going to be the challenge, is that this is not a grave danger. Yes, it's important. Yes, it's dangerous. Yes, it's fatal. But we've been dealing with this for a long time now. And to say that it is now a grave danger after all this time, I think is going to be a tough hill for them to climb. We'll see what the courts think about it. So that's going to be the legal challenge. But let's tell you at least an overview, right, of what they did yesterday when they dropped this rule on us. So it was issued yesterday. It is going to be officially published in the Federal Register today. That's when it kind of becomes real. And the law, and what it sets as an effective date is December 5th. So 30 days from its publication in the Federal Register, some of its requirements become effective. As Carl said, if you're going to have all your employees vaccinated, they've got to be vaccinated by January 4 of 2022, which doesn't allow you much lag time to figure out what you're going to do with this, just to get them fully vaccinated, because as you know, fully vaccinated means you've either gotten the 2 shots or the 1 Johnson & Johnson, then you're 2 weeks removed from that. That's your fully vaccinated status. So time is short when it comes to that. But what I did do, and I won't go through all of them with you, and I printed up for myself in case we wanted to look at it, is what this means is in the next 30 days now, without regard to whether or not you have your employees vaccinated, if you're covered by this, and we'll talk about who's covered. But within the next 30 days, there is, and if you can't really see this sheet of paper, there's a list of things you're going to have to do in your organization to comply with this rule when it becomes effective on December the 5th. From establishing I'll talk about them as we go. But really, you've got to be able to comply with the entirety of this ETS, except for having your employees vaccinated by December 5th of 2022. That's what we're staring down in terms of the timeline here. So let's first talk about who it applies to, because if you're on the call, you probably, does it apply to me? The big deal here is it applies to employers with 100 or more employees. And there's really no exceptions to that except these. Well, and let me tell you too, I got this question a lot yesterday. Does it matter in terms of location? I've got a lot of little places all across the country, Bill, but none of them have anywhere near to 100. Doesn't matter. If you've got 100 total employees, that's how they're counting. That's it. It doesn't count independent contractors, but if they're your employees, you got 100 of them anywhere, you're included in the mandate. The exceptions to that are if you're in a workplace that is already covered by the OSHA healthcare ETS, then that applies to you. If you are a federal contractor already covered by the federal contractor rule, that applies to you for at least as long as that is in place. And then there's a list of employees who while you may have 100 employees for coverage purposes, there are certain employees within your organization who are not covered by the mandate. And those are those who do not report to a workplace where there are any coworkers or customers present. It's also those people who work from home. And I've had this come up. I've got clients who have already seen pressure from private business partners, particularly in the healthcare industry, who have just leveraged their private contracts to say, our whole workforce is vaccinated. If you're going to work with us, your whole workforce needs to be vaccinated. So very much the same way the federal government is leaning on its contractors. I've actually seen that play out with private companies doing that to their subcontractors or their contractors. Say, if you're going to work with us, your workforce needs to be vaccinated. And I've had some of them say, but Bill, all our people are at home. We're paper pushers. We've sent everybody home with computers and laptops when COVID hit in the first place. And they're telling us we've got to have everybody vaccinated. How do I explain that to somebody who's working at home remotely by themselves in their own house? I say, well, you tell them the customer's requiring it. But then if you get into religious and disability accommodations, that becomes a much more difficult conversation to have. And hopefully they don't have to have it. But that's what I've been told. But at least the ETS does exclude those people who work from home. There's a final exclusion for employees who work exclusively outdoors. I hate words like exclusively as a lawyer, because if you take them at their literal meaning, does anybody work exclusively outdoors? Am I never going to show up at a centralized office somewhere to meet with a group of people? So I don't know what that means, but it says exclusively outdoors. So if you got somebody who's working on towers and whatnot, doing service and things like that, or you can envision some people who likely spend 99% of their time outside. Maybe that's who this applies to, but they said exclusively, so that's what I'm telling you. So you're either one of those, either have 100 employees or you don't. So you either cover, and this is all going to apply to you unless you've got that OSHA healthcare ETS or the federal contractor ETS, or you don't have to require this of particular employees in your organization if they meet those criteria. So we know that much. That's just coverage. That's just, do you have certain things to do within the next 30 to 60 days? And then we get into the details there. The details, let's start with a number of things. Number one is you've got to start to maintain and collect some certain records. And this has to be done. Well, let me back up. Before we even get into records, you got to establish a policy on vaccinations. I mean, either mandatory vaccinations and or a combination of mandatory vaccinations and testing. Whatever you're going to do, you've got to establish that policy and have it implemented 30 days. Okay. And for what that's worth, OSHA has published some model policies on its website. Certainly our firm and others like us have available resources in this regard as well. So those things you can either crib off of what the government has suggested. You can get with the lawyer, the firm of your choice, and ask them for advice on what they suggest in terms of templates and forms. We've got one where it's kind of plug and play, different concepts, and you can kind of pick and choose what you want. But you're going to have a policy in place in 30 days that deals with what you're going to do on mandatory vaccinations and or required testing. You're going to have to start collecting information on your employees, at least the ones to whom this rule applies. You got to determine everyone's vaccination status. So that means, a lot of employers are doing this anyway. We're going ahead and polling or sending out surveys. Some made it a mandatory survey, some made it a permissive survey. But now you've got to determine the vaccination status of your workforce, whether they are or they are not. And then depending on what you're going to do in terms of mandatory vaccination or testing, you've got to then start collecting for your vaccinated individuals acceptable proof that they are. And the ETS sets out a number of different versions of what that proof can look like, whether or not it's a card, or something from a pharmacy, or even an attestation by the individual that comes with specific bells and whistles. But you've got to collect that information to establish their vaccinated status in case OSHA were to come knocking and want you to prove it. Those records, once collected, need to be maintained as essentially medical records under OSHA's rule. Now, the good thing is, at least for right now, the ETS is in effect for 6 months, unless they make it a final rule. You've got to collect these records, and certainly you've only got to keep them during the time the ETS is in effect. At least that's what it says now. If they convert it to a final rule, they would extend out that record retention. But for right now, once you collect them, you've got to keep them essentially confidential, like you would other medical records, and have them accessible to OSHA if and whenever they show up. And there's some other bells and whistles too about employee access to those, but these are going to be, those kind of records, once collected, are going to be subject to the rule. Testing records are also going to be subject to that rule once collected. And so let's talk about the options here. So you're going to be collecting records on status, whether they're vaccinated or not, and then to the extent that they test on a regular basis to comply with this rule, you're going to be collecting those test records. So let's talk about the vaccination option first and what it says. In order to get, as Carl says, the 2 sticks in the armor to get everybody fully vaccinated, one of the big things here is you have got to provide up to 4 hours of paid time off for each employee to receive the vaccine. That includes travel. That includes each dose. So it's 4 hours of paid time off, per dose. So Johnson & Johnson is looking a lot better to folks because that's a one and done for a number of reasons, not only time compliance, but the amount of paid time off you have to give folks. So up to 4 hours of paid time off to include the travel to and from the location to get the vaccination. And then and this is the word they used, a reasonable amount of paid time off to recover from any potential side effects. And reasonable is the word lawyers argue over all the time. It doesn't give us a lot of leeway, but people do occasionally have side effects from the vaccine, flu-like symptoms and others. And people have to be given a reasonable amount of paid time off to recover from those. What does reasonable mean? That's always hard to say. Reasonable to you may not be reasonable to me. An hour may not be reasonable to some folks on this call, whereas a day may seem very reasonable to others. But that's what the ETS suggests, and you may want to, and that would be a difficult one to administer to the extent, because look, if you've seen anything when it comes to this, people feel very strongly about this, and if they don't like it, people will drag their feet. I feel really bad. I feel really bad again today. I still feel bad from my shot is what you're going to find, and that's going to be a challenge, unfortunately, I think, when it comes to this reasonable amount of PTO to recover from side effects. But that's really vaccinations. Paid time off to get them done, and a little bit of additional paid time off to recover from effects if they have them. So that's what's required of us. And by and large, the vaccination itself is paid for, right? I mean, you can go get a free vaccine just about anywhere these days, whether or not it's through your insurance or just through publicly provided vaccination programs. So there's really no question about that cost. The real cost for employers and companies on the vaccination side of the house is the paid time off to get them.
Hey, Bill.
Yeah.
That's good stuff. Well, it's crazy in a way that we're dealing with this still, but it is so important for companies to understand what you have to do, and it's all subject to a quick stroke of a pen by a federal judge. Can I, just out of curiosity, I mean, I think this is self-explanatory. I put some chat, at least the reference page for OSHA in the chat box for some quick facts. Bill's at Ogletree. We can put his stuff in there as well if you have questions. But anybody want to throw one out to Bill? Bill, you take a mundane, not specific question.
Come on. Yeah, and there's probably other stuff too. Look, the one big, before anybody asks it, because this was the big ticket item coming in, is if we do the testing, how often is it and who pays for it? Those are big ticket items for folks. So if you're somebody who shows up to the workforce once a week, you got to get tested every 7 days. Okay. If you're somebody who shows up less than that, then you got to be tested within 7 days of when you're going to the workplace. And if you're either not tested or you test positive, you're not allowed in the workplace. That's the result. And then who pays? The ETS leaves it up to the employer. So the one real critical thing here, and this is what we projected, was they want folks vaccinated. They don't want folks being tested. So what they did was allow employers to push that cost off onto the employees under this rule. It's clear that they've done that. Now that's subject to, in our state, there's no state laws on reimbursement that would require we pay that. In other states, if you have multiple state locations, there are. It's also, that doesn't apply to collective bargaining agreements for folks who, again, not too many of those in our state either. But if there's a collective bargaining agreement, then the payment of the testing is subject to that. So I didn't want to get that out there because that was one of the big things is who's going to pay for all this testing. And the other thing I'll just throw in there too, which I think is interesting, is with all our supply chain problems in this country, are there going to be enough tests?
Right.
The testing people to even get tested on such a frequent basis that they can comply with this rule? Again, more leverage to push people into getting vaccinated, which I think is the real impetus behind the way that the rule was written, and to get people vaccinated and not tested. But they had to throw in the testing option to get this thing through. So, but with that, because I know that was one of the big ticket items that we wanted to know when this got issued, I'm more than happy to take questions and do my best to answer them today.
Great. And somebody did ask a question that it doesn't matter if you've been vaccinated. I mean, if you've had COVID or antibodies, it makes no exception for anything.
Right. Yeah. Ask Aaron Rodgers of the Green Bay Packers. There's not an exception for I've had it, and so my body is already able to defend against it like a vaccine. There is no immunity exception in the ETS.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Any questions for Bill? I know that's a lot of information this morning. We probably should have taken the time out and had a swig of coffee. It is heavy, but it's important stuff to know, and literally depending on how the courts rule, which is all subject to seeing where the wind blows, but it's going to be important.
Yeah,
so,
if history tells us anything, it'll be a judge in Texas who throws up an injunction. I'll just throw that out there.
Hey, Carl.
I had a question.
Sure.
Do we have any notion of how many companies, at least locally, will be affected, and kind of what the feeling is in terms of wanting to enforce that versus not?
I don't have a good read on that one, Bill. Anecdotally, you've heard some stuff, but.
Well, look, yeah. One thing I don't have, Rusty, is an idea of the ratio of companies in South Carolina and the Columbia region that have over 100 employees. I don't have a feel for that. As far as people wanting to enforce it, I can tell you a lot of people, for a number of reasons, have no desire whatsoever to enforce this mandate. Right? I mean, and a lot of times people don't mind doing something by their own decision. Right. We oftentimes, I know my wife is good about that, making me feel like I made my own decision on something she wants me to do, and then I'm happy to do it. But if she just straight up told me to do it, I might have a little problem with that. And I think that's the way people feel. But I had somebody email me yesterday and said, Bill, there's no part of me that wants to enforce this. And if I do, I've already surveyed my employees. I'm going to lose 37% of them. I got that email yesterday from somebody. And I said, God bless you. So you're gonna have to hang in there and hope for the best on some fronts. But I mean, and this is a company that's going to clearly be covered. And I just told her, I said, you can not want to all you want, but then we'll have to have different conversations about fines and what that's going to look for you if you don't comply. I mean, a mandate is a mandate is a mandate. And unless somebody puts a stop to it, these things are requirements, and they start quick. That's the tough thing here.
Yeah.
But I will say this: if there's an opportunity for a judge to rule quickly on this, the fact that they have made so many of these pieces required to be done within 30 days, that's going to be the kind of thing that would make a judge act quickly on a case. If I were the lawyer going ahead and arguing this and say, Judge, look, for a number of reasons, this is a horrible piece of administrative law, and you've got to stop it, because right now across the country, people have 30 days to get in compliance with a law that shouldn't be on the books. And they're going to be falling all over themselves when they're just trying to run their businesses, much less deal with supply chain issues. And now they got to deal with this too. And they need some cover here, because this is, if they've, 30 days, they're going to have done all the work. And if you pull the plug then, it will have been for naught. So you got to stop it now, Judge. And that's what they're going to be arguing.
I find it fascinating because I am a policy wonk. I get that, but in the grand scheme of things, if this actually came through, and listen, I've been vaccinated. For the record, I think everybody should be vaccinated. But the point is, for those that had apprehension about it before, whether it's service line folks, truckers, teachers, hospital nurses, whatever, we are in a tight labor market. And for those that choose not to do this and take a walk, it's going to be hard. So anyway, Bill, thanks for your time today. Sure. I really, really appreciate you. I hope you still answer my calls sometime.
No, look, I hope look, this is you talk about drinking from a fire hose, and this is a lot to swallow on a Friday morning when hopefully folks are in blue jeans today or working from home. We're supposed to be sipping coffee and starting to think about the weekend. You talk about a weekend killer for a lawyer. This is it for me, because we got work to do here. But thankfully, I've got about 900 other lawyers in my firm, and some people just dedicated to this. So I'm going to be cribbing off a lot of the work that they do to get us all geared up for this thing. But yeah, no, this is a lot to digest, and particularly with the strong feelings behind it, you couple those two things together. It's not the most pleasant thing to be talking about on a Friday morning, but it's the reality of the situation we've got today.
Well, appreciate you sharing your insights with us. And again, Bill with Ogletree is the new managing partner. So thanks. Congratulations to you on herding cats. Congratulations. Listen, all right. We got lots to talk about next week. And so I'll save the political stuff to next week. Specifically, we're going to have some good intel on the mayoral race next week and the city council runoff race. Also, I hope to have a little better update on the redistricting map and the great screwing over Richland County. I'll work on the better term there. But we got to really work on that. But I will close you with a couple of things. On this date, 1935, Parker Brothers, thank you, Parker Brothers, released Monopoly. How crazy is that? They released it right after the Great Depression. Interesting, it's still around. So I hope y'all go play a game. That may be more interesting than the USC Florida game. Just saying. But we're glad to have the Spurriers back in town for the weekend. And so if you see them out and about, wish them well. They're good people. So, all right, drink lots of coffee, stay warm. And if you need help with the OSHA stuff, feel free to call Bill. All right, we'll see y'all next week. Have a good weekend.
See y'all.
Thanks, Bill.
Yes, sir. Anytime.